The invitation arrived in a pristine, ivory envelope, its golden embossing shimmering under the soft kitchen light. She stared at it, her fingers frozen in place. It was an invitation to her ex-husband's wedding. The very man who had once promised her forever was now vowing the same to another woman. The weight of it settled in her chest, an ache both familiar and unwelcome. Her first instinct was to tear it apart, to reject the cruelty of being asked to witness the ceremony of the man who had discarded her. But something inside her resisted. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe the need for closure. She had spent the last 2 years rebuilding herself, forcing herself to stand tall despite the humiliation and heartbreak he had left her with. Was this her moment to finally put the past to rest? As she sat at her modest kitchen table, her mind wandered to the day he had left. It had not been a gradual unraveling, no slow drift that hinted at a love fading away. No, his departure had been swift, brutal, and filled with cutting words. He had told her she was a burden, that she lacked ambition, that his new fiancé was everything she could never be. The words had sliced through her like a blade, leaving wounds that still ached on nights when silence was too loud. Now, as she held the invitation, she could hear his voice echoing in her memory, filled with disdain and finality. She had pleaded then, not for his love, but for an explanation. None had come. Only the sound of the front door closing behind him. She exhaled, running her fingers over the smooth paper. The name of the venue was printed in elegant cursive, a grand estate known for its lavish affairs, the kind of place she had once dreamed of but had never felt worthy of. That, too, had been his doing, planting in her the seed of unworthiness, watering it with every insult, until she had believed it herself. But she was not the same woman he had left. The years had not only hardened her, they had refined her. She had built a life on her own, found strength in the solitude he had forced upon her. Maybe attending would be the final act of her transformation, the moment she realized she no longer needed his validation, nor his absence, to define her. Her fingers tightened around the invitation. She would go. Not as a broken woman seeking approval, but as a silent witness to the life he had chosen. Let him see that she had survived. Let him believe, even if just for a second, that perhaps he had lost more than he had gained. She could still remember the early days, back when love had been gentle and full of promises whispered between tangled sheets. He had been charming then, filling her days with laughter and stolen kisses. He had convinced her that he was her safe place, that the world was too harsh for someone as soft-hearted as her. And she had believed him, surrendering to the warmth of his arms, never once suspecting that those very arms would one day push her away. Their love had not died all at once, it had eroded, piece by piece, like waves against a fragile shore. At first, the criticisms had been subtle, a comment about the way she dressed, a suggestion that she try harder to impress his colleagues. Then they became sharper, cutting through her confidence like glass. He told her she lacked refinement, that she was too simple, too ordinary. He compared her to the women he worked with, sleek and polished, women who knew how to carry themselves in a way that commanded admiration. She had tried to change, tried to mold herself into the version he seemed to want, but it was never enough. With every effort she made, he only pulled further away. She had blamed herself when he left, convinced that if she had been better, if she had tried harder, he might have stayed. It took her months to realize that love was not something one had to earn. It took even longer to accept that the fault had never been hers. Now, as she prepared to face him again, she wondered if he had ever truly loved her at all. The venue was grander than she had imagined. Towering chandeliers bathed the ballroom in a golden glow, their light bouncing off the crystal glasses set upon the pristine white tablecloths. Laughter and chatter filled the space, guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits, sipping champagne as they awaited the ceremony. She had expected to feel out of place, but the moment she stepped inside, a strange calm settled over her. She had been here before, in different forms, always believing she was never enough. But tonight, she refused to shrink. The murmurs started the moment she entered, whispers brushing against her ears like sharp-edged secrets. "Isn't that his ex-wife?" one woman murmured, her voice laced with curiosity and amusement. "She actually showed up," another scoffed, barely masking her laughter. Their gazes roamed over her, dissecting her, searching for cracks in her composure. But she gave them nothing. She walked with measured steps, her chin lifted, her dress, simple but elegant, hugging her figure with quiet confidence. She spotted him near the altar, his back turned as he spoke with the officiant. The sight of him no longer sent a pang through her chest. He was just a man now, not the ghost she had been chasing. But then, as if sensing her presence, he turned. Their eyes met, and for the briefest second, something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps even discomfort. Good, she thought. Let him feel it. Let him know that she was not the woman he had left behind. She should have expected it, but the cruelty still stung. The bride, draped in an opulent gown that shimmered under the lights, wasted no time in making her presence known. With a perfectly rehearsed smile, she sauntered over, her high heels clicking against the marble floor. "Oh, how thoughtful of you to come," she purred, her voice dripping with condescension. "I told him to invite you. It's only fair that you see what real happiness looks like." The room grew quieter as eyes turned toward them, sensing the impending spectacle. The ex-wife held her ground, offering nothing but silence in response. But the bride was relentless. She leaned in closer, her whisper loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You know, he told me all about you," she continued, feigning sympathy. "How you never really fit into his world. How exhausting it was to carry your dead weight. Must be hard, knowing you were just a mistake." The words sliced deep, but she refused to let them see her bleed. Instead, she smiled, a small, knowing smile that rattled the bride more than any retort could. "Enjoy your wedding," she said, her voice even. "I hope he gives you exactly what you deserve." And with that, she turned, leaving the bride fuming, the guests whispering, and the air crackling with something unspoken. She had barely taken a step away when his voice cut through the air, sharp and laced with amusement. "You actually came," he said, his tone teetering between disbelief and mockery. There was no warmth in his gaze, only the smug satisfaction of a man who believed himself untouchable. He took a slow sip of his champagne, eyes raking over her as if assessing whether she was still as insignificant as he had once convinced himself she was. "I didn't think you'd have the nerve. Then again, you always did have a habit of clinging to things long after they were over." The words were meant to wound, to diminish her in front of his new world, but they rolled off her like rain against stone. She met his gaze, unwavering, and in that moment, she saw something unexpected, a flicker of something beneath his confidence. Was it regret? No, not quite. It was discomfort. The realization struck her like a quiet victory. He had expected her to be small, to shrink beneath his presence, but she stood before him with a dignity that unsettled him. She could see it in the way he shifted slightly, the way his fiancée tightened her grip on his arm, sensing that control was slipping. "You're right," she said evenly, her voice betraying none of the storm brewing within. "I did hold on to something for too long. But not anymore." And with that, she turned, walking away without another glance, leaving him standing there, his smirk faltering just enough for her to know she had won something, even if only in the smallest of ways. Laughter rippled through the crowd as whispers grew into outright amusement at her expense. The bride's friends, glossy and cruel, covered their smirks behind delicate hands, whispering behind champagne flutes. "Poor thing," one of them murmured, voice dripping with mock sympathy. "It must be so humiliating, seeing what she's been replaced with." Another chuckled, her gaze sweeping over the ex-wife's dress with barely concealed disdain. "I can't believe she actually showed up. Did she think he'd change his mind? That's just sad." She could hear every word, feel the weight of their mockery pressing against her like a tide meant to swallow her whole. Once, their cruelty would have broken her, would have sent her retreating into herself, questioning every part of who she was. But not tonight. Tonight, she understood something she hadn't before. Their laughter wasn't just about her, it was about the illusion they had all built around the groom, the belief that he had traded up, that his new life was polished and perfect. And yet, beneath their amusement, there was something else, something bitter, something uneasy. Because she stood there, unbroken, refusing to be reduced to the role they had written for her. The noise around her faded into a dull hum as she took a steady breath, centering herself. She would not let them see her falter. Instead, she did something unexpected, she smiled. Not a forced, fragile thing, but a quiet, knowing smile that unsettled those around her. The bride's eyes narrowed, sensing a shift she couldn't quite place. The groom, too, stiffened, as if suddenly aware that he no longer had control over the narrative. For the first time that evening, it was not she who seemed out of place, it was them. She moved through the room with the same grace she had always possessed, now sharpened by resilience. She would not let them steal her dignity, nor would she give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Let them whisper. Let them mock. Their words held no power over her anymore. Because she knew something they did not, she had already won. She had walked through fire and emerged whole, while they were still playing at perfection, afraid of what lay beneath. And that was the real difference between them. The chatter softened as the ceremony was set to begin. Guests took their seats, the hush of anticipation settling over the grand hall. The bride, glowing with triumph, took her place at the altar, her delicate hand resting possessively on the groom's. He barely looked at her, his eyes flickering instead toward the woman he had left behind. It was subtle, but she caught it. The ex-wife held her chin high, refusing to meet his gaze, refusing to acknowledge the silent question lingering in his eyes. Whatever it was, it no longer mattered. The priest stepped forward, clearing his throat. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, but beneath the solemnity, something felt off. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken hanging between the vows that had yet to be exchanged. The ex-wife, seated quietly near the back, could sense it, though she did not know why. Then, as the priest prepared to begin, he hesitated, just for a moment, just long enough for a ripple of unease to pass through the room. Something was coming. Before the priest could speak, the bride turned, her voice carrying through the silent hall. "I just want to take a moment," she said sweetly, though there was venom beneath her words, "to acknowledge someone special in the crowd tonight." The guests stirred, a murmur of confusion rippling through them. The bride's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she locked onto the ex-wife. It's not every day you get to see living proof of why some people just aren't meant for this kind of life. The laughter was hesitant at first, scattered chuckles from those unsure if it was appropriate to laugh during a ceremony. But then, emboldened by the bride's confidence, it grew, rolling through the room in waves. The ex-wife felt every eye turned toward her, some in amusement, others in pity. But she refused to react. She would not give them what they wanted. She remained still, her expression unreadable. Yet, even as the humiliation threatened to swallow her whole, she noticed something strange. The priest was watching, his expression unreadable, his hands tightening over the book he held. Just as the laughter reached its peak, the priest lifted his hand, his voice steady and unwavering. "That will be enough," he said, his tone cutting through the room like steel. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a stunned silence. The bride blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Excuse me?" she asked, forcing a tight smile. The priest did not return her smile. Instead, he turned to the groom, his eyes sharp and knowing. "Before we proceed, there is something that must be said," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of something far greater than mere ceremony. The groom's face paled, his fingers tightening around the bride's hand. Marriage is built on truth, and yet, here we stand, surrounded by deception. A murmur spread through the guests, confusion giving way to intrigue. The ex-wife, for the first time, felt the weight of her humiliation begin to shift, not onto her, but onto the man standing at the altar. The priest's gaze never wavered as he continued, "There are things that must be known before any vows are spoken. And I will not be the one to let this union begin under false pretenses." The silence was deafening. And then, just as the ex-wife had thought she had endured the worst of the night, the truth finally began to unravel. A ripple of unease spread through the room as the priest's words settled. The bride stiffened, her carefully composed smile faltering for the first time. The groom's grip on her hand tightened, his knuckles white against his skin. Guests exchanged glances, some leaning forward, drawn in by the unexpected disruption. The ex-wife sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, though she didn't understand why. She had anticipated humiliation tonight, but not like this. Not with the attention suddenly shifting, not with the weight of something far heavier hanging in the air. The priest's eyes never left the groom, his expression unreadable. The groom swallowed hard, his posture rigid as if bracing for impact. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice carrying the first hint of unease. The priest took a slow breath before speaking again. "Before any vows are exchanged, before this marriage is consecrated, I must fulfill my duty to ensure that this union is not built on deceit." The tension in the room thickened, heavy and suffocating. There are things about this man that remain unspoken, things that his bride deserves to know before she binds herself to him. A hush fell over the crowd, eyes darting between the priest and the groom, waiting for the revelation that was about to unfold. The bride's fingers trembled in the groom's grasp as she turned to face him, her expression darkening with suspicion. "What is he talking about?" she asked, her voice sharp, brittle. The groom forced a laugh, though it rang hollow in the vast room. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, his eyes darting toward the priest in barely concealed panic. "Whatever you think you know, you're mistaken." But the priest remained steadfast. "Am I?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Or would you prefer I tell your bride, and everyone here, the real reason your first marriage ended?" A gasp rippled through the crowd, and the ex-wife felt her breath catch in her throat. The bride's expression twisted into something unreadable, her grip on his arm tightening as though she could force the truth from him. "Tell me," she demanded. "Tell me what he's talking about." The groom clenched his jaw, his composure fracturing. The room was closing in on him, the walls pressing tighter. And then, the priest delivered the blow. He did not leave his ex-wife because she was a burden, he said, his voice clear, unwavering. He left because he drained her financially, manipulated her into believing she was nothing without him, and when there was nothing left for him to take, he walked away. The bride staggered back as if struck, her face draining of color. The confidence she had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago shattered, replaced by something raw, something dangerously close to fear. The groom's face twisted with fury, but before he could protest, the murmurs around them grew into a murky wave of voices. "Is that true?" someone whispered. "He took everything from her," another muttered. The guests, who had laughed at the ex-wife's expense, now looked at the groom with something different, disgust, maybe even guilt. The bride's voice trembled as she spoke, her hands clenching into fists. "You told me she was pathetic," she hissed, barely holding herself together. "You told me she was weak, that she held you back. But it was you, wasn't it? You were the parasite." The groom shook his head violently, reaching for her. "It's not like that," he said through gritted teeth, but the panic in his voice betrayed him. The bride jerked away from his touch, her entire body trembling. "How much of what you told me was a lie?" she demanded, her voice breaking. The weight of her own humiliation, public, irreversible, settled over her like a crushing tide. The room pulsed with hushed conversation, voices weaving through the tension like threads of a fractured tapestry. Guests who had only minutes ago delighted in the ex-wife's discomfort now exchanged uneasy glances, their amusement curdling into shame. "I never knew," one of them murmured. "He always made it sound like she was the problem." Another, a woman dressed in an emerald gown, crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "I actually pitied him," she admitted, her voice tinged with bitterness. "And all this time, he was the one destroying her?" The ex-wife remained still, watching the scene unfold with quiet disbelief. She had dreamed of a moment like this, not for revenge, but for truth. For years, she had carried the weight of his words, the cruel labels he had pinned to her, convincing herself that maybe she had deserved them. But now, under the glaring lights of the grandest wedding she had ever stepped foot in, the truth was no longer hers to bear alone. It belonged to everyone. And as the murmurs grew louder, as the guests turned against the groom one by one, she realized something else. He was finally standing where he had once left her. Alone. The groom's confidence, so carefully constructed, began to crack like fragile glass beneath the weight of scrutiny. He turned sharply to the priest, his face contorted with fury. "You had no right," he seethed. "This is a wedding, not a courtroom." The priest remained unshaken, his expression solemn. "A marriage built on deceit will not stand," he replied simply. "I have seen too many unions crumble because of hidden truths. I will not bless another." Desperation clawed at the groom's voice as he turned to the bride. "You don't believe this, do you?" he pleaded, his mask slipping entirely. "I love you. That's all that should matter." But the bride's eyes were distant now, her shoulders squared with a resolve he had not expected. "Love?" she echoed, almost laughing. "I don't even know who you are." And with that, she reached for the diamond ring that sparkled on her finger, twisting it free with slow, deliberate precision. The moment the band slipped from her hand and hit the polished floor with a soft, echoing clink, the room knew it was over. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The bride stepped back from the altar, leaving the groom stranded beneath the grand arch of white roses and empty promises. She turned on her heel, her gown billowing around her like a storm about to break. The guests, once eager spectators, now felt like intruders in a scene they were never meant to witness. Some began whispering hurried goodbyes, slipping toward the exit as if afraid the shame in the air would stain them. The groom stood frozen, his face pale, his hands still outstretched toward a future that had just crumbled to dust. But no one reached for him. No one offered comfort. And when his gaze finally, inevitably, landed on the ex-wife, she met it with nothing but quiet finality. There would be no more words between them. No more explanations. No more battles to fight. He had already lost everything. And she had finally won her freedom. The weight of the moment settled over the grand hall like a dense fog, suffocating and absolute. The bride had vanished down the aisle, the whispers of guests trailing behind her, but the ex-wife remained seated, unmoving. She had not come seeking revenge, nor had she expected this spectacle to unfold before her eyes. And yet, here she was, watching the man who had once held power over her stand alone in his ruin. He did not call after his bride, did not attempt to chase what had slipped through his fingers. Instead, he stood frozen, his carefully constructed world crumbling beneath the weight of exposed truth. She could feel his eyes on her, pleading, searching for something, sympathy, perhaps, or recognition. But she had nothing left to give. Slowly, she rose from her seat, smoothing the fabric of her dress with deliberate ease. There was no satisfaction in watching him suffer, no triumph in witnessing his fall. If anything, she felt a hollow kind of relief, like the closing of a chapter that had long overstayed its welcome. As she turned toward the exit, she felt the gazes of the remaining guests follow her, no longer filled with scorn but with something closer to quiet respect. She had come here expecting to be humiliated, to be reminded of all the ways she had been deemed unworthy. Instead, she was walking away as the only one who had not been undone. The realization was bittersweet. She did not look back, not once, as she stepped beyond the towering doors, out into the cool night air where the weight of the past could no longer touch her. The evening breeze carried the distant hum of traffic as she stepped onto the cobblestone path leading away from the estate. She should have felt lighter, freed from the invisible chains that had bound her for so long, yet an odd numbness settled in her bones. She had spent so much time defining herself through the pain he had left behind, through the battle of proving her worth. Now that it was over, now that the past had folded in on itself, she was left with a question she had not anticipated: who was she beyond the wreckage? Lost in thought, she nearly missed the presence of a man standing a few steps ahead. He had been watching from the shadows, his posture composed but alert, as if waiting for the right moment to approach. She paused, instinctively wary, until recognition dawned. He was older, his hair grayed at the temples, but she had seen him before, years ago, at corporate events where her ex-husband had once paraded her like an accessory. A businessman, she recalled, though his name escaped her. As she hesitated, he offered a small, knowing smile. "Quite the show back there," he mused, his voice even. "You handled yourself well." There was no malice in his tone, no trace of the cruel amusement she had grown so accustomed to. Just quiet observation, tinged with something else, curiosity. She met his gaze cautiously, unsure of what he wanted. "I didn't handle anything," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It all fell apart on its own." The man studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Perhaps," he conceded. "But not many would have stood their ground the way you did." He slipped his hands into the pockets of his tailored suit, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Your ex-husband spoke of you often," he continued. "Not in flattering terms, I'm afraid. But I've learned to judge people for myself." Something in his words unsettled her, though she could not place why. She had spent so long being dismissed, belittled, cast aside. The idea that someone, especially someone from her ex-husband's world, had seen past the carefully woven narrative felt foreign. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, a frown creasing her brow. The man exhaled lightly, as if weighing his next words. "Because I see potential where others see ruin," he said simply. "And I suspect you're capable of far more than you've been led to believe." He reached into his coat, pulling out a sleek business card. "If you're ready to start proving them wrong, call me." She turned the card over between her fingers, the weight of it unfamiliar. For years, she had existed in the shadows of someone else's ambition, made to believe she was nothing more than an afterthought. Now, standing here with a future she had never considered unfolding before her, she felt the smallest spark of something she had not allowed herself in a long time: hope. She glanced back up at the man, studying the sharp lines of his face, the patience in his eyes. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked cautiously. "A position," he said without hesitation. "One that requires intelligence, resilience, and the ability to adapt." He tilted his head slightly. "You've already proven you have all three." The simplicity of his confidence in her was jarring. She had spent so long being questioned, belittled, made to feel like she was never enough. And yet, here he was, seeing something in her that she hadn't yet learned to see in herself. The thought was terrifying, but also thrilling. She took a slow breath before slipping the card into her clutch. "I'll think about it," she said. It was not a promise, not yet. But for the first time, she allowed herself to consider that maybe, just maybe, she had been meant for more all along. Inside the grand hall, the groom stood frozen amidst the remnants of his ruined wedding. The flowers, the music, the grand declarations of love, it all seemed hollow now, an elaborate stage built on a foundation that had crumbled beneath him. The guests had begun to disperse, their once eager whispers now filled with quiet judgment. He could feel their gazes, not with admiration, but with the sting of disappointment, of ridicule. He had always believed himself untouchable, weaving lies so seamlessly that even he had begun to believe them. But the truth had unraveled him, thread by thread, until there was nothing left to cling to. His fiancée, no, his former fiancée, was gone, her presence erased as if she had never been there at all. And the ex-wife, the woman he had once dismissed as weak, had walked away with something he would never regain: dignity. The realization burned. He had spent so much time trying to convince the world that he had traded up, that his past had been a mistake, but now, standing in the ruins of his own making, he was the only one left to face what he had done. No fortune, no charm, no carefully spun lies could change that. He had lost. And worse, he knew he had deserved it. The bride's heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she stormed out of the venue, rage burning beneath her perfectly applied makeup. The night air was cool, but her skin felt hot with humiliation, her breath coming in sharp bursts. How had she been so blind? She had believed his every word, let him fill her head with lies about his ex-wife, had laughed along as he spun tales of her weakness. And now she was the one left humiliated, discarded before she could even say "I do." The realization seared through her, not just the betrayal, but the sheer foolishness of having trusted him. She pulled out her phone, her manicured fingers trembling with fury. He had painted himself as a man of wealth, of power, but she knew better now. His confidence, his status, it had all been an illusion, a carefully curated act meant to keep people fooled. But she had been close enough to see the cracks, and now she intended to widen them. With a swift motion, she dialed a number. "It's over," she said without preamble. "And I want every deal, every contract, every favor he's ever asked for revoked. By morning." There was a pause on the other end before the voice replied, "Consider it done." She ended the call, satisfaction settling over her like a cool balm. If she had to fall, she would not fall alone. Inside, the last of the guests were making their way toward the exits, their previous amusement now replaced with discomfort. No one wanted to be associated with a sinking ship, and the groom, once the charming, self-assured man who had stood so proudly at the altar, now looked pitiful, like a man drowning in the very ocean he had created. The laughter that had once filled the air had faded, leaving only whispers, sidelong glances, and hushed exits. The society he had so carefully tried to impress was abandoning him, one by one. Some guests were already making quiet phone calls, distancing themselves from him in real time. Business connections that had once been secured with false promises were now dissolving like sugar in water. His name, which had carried a certain weight in these circles, now felt tainted. A few guests cast lingering glances toward the door where his ex-wife had disappeared, their expressions unreadable. Perhaps some felt guilty for having laughed at her. Perhaps others simply recognized the strength it had taken for her to walk away. But no one spared the groom a second glance. His world had moved on, leaving him stranded in its ruins. Time had a way of reshaping everything. A year had passed since that disastrous wedding, and with it came the slow but inevitable shifts in fortune. The ex-wife, once bound by the weight of humiliation, now stood on the other side of it, stronger, freer. The business cards she had once hesitated to take had led to opportunities she had never imagined, doors opening where she had once believed there were none. She had worked tirelessly, not to prove herself to anyone, but because she had finally seen her own worth. And now, for the first time in years, she was thriving, not as someone's ex, not as someone's regret, but as herself. The event she attended that evening was nothing like the wedding she had walked away from. It was a business gala, sleek and refined, filled with faces that had once only existed in the periphery of her life. But tonight, she was not just an observer. She belonged here. Dressed in elegance, she carried herself with quiet confidence, the weight of the past no longer pressing against her shoulders. And yet, as she moved through the room, she caught sight of something, or rather, someone, she had not expected to see again. A man standing alone, his once tailored suit now slightly worn, his expression dull with defeat. The groom, no, just a man now, stripped of the title and prestige he had once clung to, looked up and met her gaze. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by something more complex. Shame, perhaps. Regret. He hesitated, as if debating whether to approach her, whether he had any right to. And then, as if drawn by something beyond his control, he took a step forward. He started, but his voice faltered. She did not look away, but there was no anger in her gaze. No satisfaction either. Only finality. He had already lost everything, his career, his reputation, his influence. There was nothing left for her to take from him, nothing left to win. He had done it all to himself. And so, when he finally spoke, his voice low with something dangerously close to pleading, she simply tilted her head. "I don't need an apology," she said, her voice calm. "I never did. What I needed was for you to no longer matter." His face twisted slightly, as if the truth of her words had landed harder than any insult could. She gave him a small, almost kind smile before turning away. That was all. That was enough. As she stepped outside, the night air cool against her skin, she inhaled deeply. There was no heaviness in her chest, no lingering bitterness. Only the vast, open feeling of freedom. She had spent years believing she had lost something the day he left. But now she understood, she had never lost anything. She had simply been given the chance to rebuild, to step away from a life that had never truly been hers. She glanced down at her reflection in the darkened glass of a nearby window. The woman looking back at her was whole, untethered from the ghosts of her past. She had thought, once, that survival meant proving him wrong, proving to the world that she wasn't weak. But now she knew, true victory wasn't about proving anything at all. It was about living. And for the first time in a long time, she was. The man who had once been so sure of himself now sat alone, watching as she walked away from him for the last time. There was no dramatic ending, no desperate plea that would change what had already been decided. He had spent years believing he was superior, that she was nothing without him. But now, he was the one left behind, and she was the one who had moved forward. He realized, too late, that he had never broken her. He had only set her free.